Earlier this month, an exhibition at the National Museum of China, including relics sent by South Korea, sparked much anger here following revelations that the Chinese museum had blatantly edited out the ancient kingdoms of Goguryeo and Balhae from Korea's history. So why was this crucial historical information omitted? Also, what was China's Northeast project that sparked rampant allegations of historical negationism? And what can be done to curb China's attempts to distort history? Welcome to Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders, our daily panel session on stories that shape the society we share. Today we touch upon China's broad attempts to rewrite history and the possible reasons behind its historical negationism. For more, I have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, welcome back.
Good to be here.
I also have Professor Chu from Kyung University. Professor Chu, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Right. So today, let's begin with you then. Let's start off with the more recent controversy involving the national museums of South Korea and China.
Right, Sunny. It started with an exhibition at the National Museum of China. It involves ancient bronze relics of China, Korea, and Japan. And this exhibition is actually being jointly organized by the national museums of these three countries. So the controversy that surfaced here is a chronological table of ancient Korean history that the National Museum of Korea sent to the museum in China with 15 relics is missing important Korean ancient kingdoms. So it seems that those have been removed by China from the table, and we're talking here about Goguryeo and Balhae. And one of the relics, for instance, is a national treasure, the bell of Cheonheungsa, which is from the Goguryeo. Korea accused the Chinese museum of attempting a distortion to history. And I took a look at the description of the exhibition on China's website of the National Museum. And what they say is that they are highlighting cooperation between the three countries, as well as a bright future with unlimited potential, especially with this year marking the 30th anniversary between South Korea and China's diplomatic ties. But despite such desires of a bright future, the exhibition seems to be doing quite the opposite. China has been trying to claim sovereignty over ancient Korean kingdoms as part of its so-called Northeast project. So Seoul has warned to withdraw its relics if China's museum won't correct the chronological table. The museum reluctantly responded. What they did is they decided to remove the table altogether. So this is adding to suspicions that China's museum has modified the description to distort history.
Right, unfortunately then. Professor Chu, so I just mentioned the Northeast project. Could we start with a little bit of information about that particular project by China?
Yes, she did. It expanded from 2002 to 2007. First, it was originally and supposedly an economic development project for northeastern region in China. And then that's how it started in 2002. And then 2004, they started to touch upon, history in northeastern region of China, and which touches upon North Korea and South Korea's history, ancient history. And then, so basically they carry out this project on the two fronts. One is economic and the other is history. And history being a great tool of legitimacy, great tool for legitimacy, and Chinese government, while they wanted to legitimize their endeavors, economic pursuit in northeastern region of China, that's how they wanted to legitimize their actions. In a way, because northeastern region is traditionally and historically part of China, and it has been so, and obviously there are some Korean minorities mostly residing in there, and they had to distort what the Korean Chinese minorities were teaching to their kids in the context of Chinese ancient history. Right. So they wanted to correct that.
Professor Chu, some scholars claim that this particular project, the Northeast project, was just a pretext perhaps to expand China's borders, that is, and perhaps lay some form of claim over North Korea in the event of a sudden, unexpected political change here in this part of the world. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. I was really, skeptical about that claim before in 2017. In 2017, April, if you recollect a little bit, there was a first summit meeting between former President of the United States, Donald Trump, and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Florida. And, President Trump raised this question, what's your relationship with the Korean Peninsula? And Xi Jinping surprisingly answered that Korean Peninsula is historically part of China. And I was like, what does it mean here? So I think we can draw this analogy. I think if I explain this, I think I could help the foreign audience to understand better. The Jews community is large in the United States, is one of the ethnic groups there, and the United States is committed to the defense of Israel. And we can apply the same logic and analogy to our understanding of China's perception of its standing with the Korean Peninsula in a historical context.
Right,
Yes.
I see. Meanwhile, so along with this disturbing dispute over the domain of ancient kingdoms and territory, there is also quite a bit of debate over our traditional attire, the hanbok and even kimchi, right?
Right, Sunny. If you'd ask anyone on the street to name something that's typical Korean, I think many people on the spot would mention kimchi and hanbok as well. But even hanbok and kimchi have fallen victim to misappropriation. So let's go back to the Beijing Winter Olympics, the opening ceremony. Back then, a participant in the ceremony wore Korea's traditional dress hanbok, waving China's flag while representing one of China's ethnic groups. This incident sparked anger in Korea as it was seen as cultural appropriation. China's stance was, the embassy said, that the Korean people of China and the Korean Peninsula share the same origin and have a common traditional culture, including costumes, is what they said. Now, while the Olympic incident itself, actually, it led to some mixed responses by the public, as some did see the woman in the hanbok clearly representing an estimated 2 million ethnic Koreans living in China. This was actually not the only time Beijing showed suspicious moves regarding hanbok. For instance, China's top search engine Baidu described hanbok originates from hanfu, which is a Chinese traditional garment. And even IT giant Xiaomi used hanbok images, wrapping it as Chinese culture. And also the reason for why many Koreans were furious about the incident back at the Beijing Olympics was because not long ago there was also the incident regarding Korea's main side dish, kimchi. It had also become a target to apparent intentions by China to take claim of Korea's culture, or food rather, by reporting it has won a certification from the International Organization for Standardization for its kimchi making process, but it's actually for its pao chai, a similar pickled vegetable dish.
Right. So essentially, kimchi and hanbok, of course, are Korean cultural aspects. And Professor
Yes.
Chu, would you say that China's claim over Korea's culture has perhaps been more common in recent times? And if so, how do you explain it?
I could look at it from two different perspectives. One is out of China is really jealous and contemptuous because, just like Soa just explained, our culture has been really appealing to the public worldwide, and it is really well introduced through our, cultural contents and entertainment businesses, and we're just soaring high, and I think there's jealous and contempt, working simultaneously. And the other perspective would be China's anxiety, because China is getting anxious over, the Korean Chinese minority in Chinese society. Because if you look at the composition of Korean Chinese minorities as a whole, you can seldom see any of them has a foreign origin. Yep. So, one of the very, very few ethnic minority groups with foreign origin ties is Korean Chinese. And that's where they see a danger underlying in the relationship between Koreans and Korean Chinese.
Right, I see. And against that backdrop, Soa, how has the foreign media perhaps been covering China's attempts at cultural appropriation?
Well, you can find quite a number of coverages on the kimchi and hanbok issues. The BBC, for instance, had a piece on how kimchi rekindled a decades-long feud. That's the title. And it thoroughly introduced South Korea's national dish as an intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. But what was interesting is that it cited an expert saying that the battle over who owns kimchi may have been triggered by a simple misunderstanding led to mistranslation. And also back in February, the AP, Deutsche Welle, and VOA, they focused on how politicians have been blasting against China during that incident with the woman wearing a hanbok during the opening ceremony, and especially how anti-China sentiment has been growing before the political elections here in Korea. Now, what I especially found interesting is a piece by the Diplomat that focused on the U.S. calling for Washington to pay more attention to the China-South Korea culture clash. In other words, China's power ambitions in the region that might also impact the U.S. In the end.
Right, I see. And Professor Ju, very briefly speaking, there are pundits who link this initiative by China to lay claim on the history and culture of its neighbors to its rivalry with the U.S. What do you say?
Yeah, there could be some linkage there, but I'm going to make it short. Okay, China's intent is really clear and crisp. They want to evoke our, fond memories with China in the ancient times. So they want us to embrace China's influence. They want to embrace our nostalgia towards China and cherish our good memories with China back in the days. That's when when China flourished, we also flourished. That's the same simple logic there. So they want to evoke our good memories and what we cherished in the past in relationship with China.
Right, but hopefully that will happen without distorting history, right?
Exactly.
So beyond Korea, I hear countries including Vietnam and Malaysia also previously took issue with China's attempts to claim territory. Am I right?
Right, and I will focus on an animation that is related to what other countries like Malaysia and Vietnam have been claiming. So this is about one of the most contentious territorial conflicts in the world, the South China Sea dispute. While China lays claim to around 80% of the South China Sea, expanding its military presence and building islands, it also took to the entertainment sector to spread its claim. And DreamWorks animation Abominable shows a map supporting China's claim to the disputed South China Sea by depicting its so-called 9-line policy, which is a line that extends for 2,000 kilometers from Chinese mainland. And this area overlaps with sovereignty claims by Malaysia, Vietnam, and also other Asian countries. So what happened is that this movie has been pulled from theaters in these countries that are named Vietnam, Malaysia, as well as the Philippines.
Right, I see. Professor Chu, do you see these ongoing cultural and historical disputes between South Korea and China perhaps negatively affecting their future diplomatic agenda?
Oh, very much, especially among the young generation in both countries. Obviously, it has affected greatly and negatively, Korea's perception of China. And since 2004, that's when the Northeast Project started to was carried out, and since then, China lags behind the United States, Japan, even North Korea, in terms of our, vulnerability towards China, and China has never is still lagging behind North Korea in that term. It's surprising. And hopefully, the young generation will increase their contacts and exchanges, and hopefully they will come to a better mutual understanding, and hopefully we can avoid this becoming a diplomatic agenda.
Right, hopefully. And so, briefly again, what can you share with us about public efforts here, perhaps, to place public efforts that is in place to protect our history and culture?
Well, quite recently, last Friday, a meeting of diplomatic missions in China took place to address the recent incident regarding the National Museum in China and to prevent similar cases from happening again. So the South Korean Foreign Ministry since 2011 has been holding annual meetings related to historic issues at their overseas missions. And this time, they actually met for the first time in 6 months although this is usually an annual event, which shows the dire situation regarding the recent chronology table. And also to stop the false perception stemming from China's claim on industrial standard for kimchi, the South Korean Agriculture Ministry has actually made a change to its translation guidelines regarding China's what it calls kimchi. So shinchi is the Chinese translation for Korean kimchi and not pao chai, which can lead to misinterpretation.
Right, of course. Professor Ju, perhaps we could end with a few words on the importance of learning about one's history to ensure its preservation.
Yes, we have to study. The prerequisite is to study your own history, but we are not studying our own history, except for junior high school students.
Right, we need to study. I'll make note of that as well.
Thank
All
you.
right, Professor Ju, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts and time today. And
Thank
Soa,
you.
thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.